Hello, my name's Mogg Morgan. This is my talk, Apophis, Mother of All Curses, which I did a version of for the Witchcraft Museum in Boscastle. So I just thought I'd talk about it really. See what you think. Okay, so 10 measures of magic have come into the world. Egypt received 9 of these. The rest of the world 1 measure. That's an old quote from the Talmud, in fact. It tells you the status of Egyptian magic in the ancient world and pretty much ever since. I say it again, 10 measures of magic have come into the world. Egypt received 9 of these, the rest of the world 1. So 9 to 1 basically. So magic is a big thing in Egypt. Now in a nutshell, for this talk on the origin of curses in magic, and primarily from Egypt, they're summed up in these 2 pictures on the screen, one of which is a curse image from Egypt in the 2nd to the 3rd century of the Common Era, our era, which is now in the Louvre, and you can see it's a kind of bound figure with lots of pins in it. And the second image to compare it with is actually from Malaya, but it's almost samples like it could almost be. It's in the Pitt Museum now, and if I didn't tell you where it came from, it could you might think it came from any time during the last thousands of years, really. In fact, it was collected by the folklorist Skeet in South Devon. So you can see a wax image with pins to cause illness, and it was published originally in a book called Malay Magic by Skeet, and he tells us it's made from the wax of a deserted bee's comb, which is another interesting addition to the magic. The construction of these images out of wax is sort of kind of totally familiar from folklore now, but he found it even adds another, and there's a meaning, there's a specific reason for that, the reason for it we discovered within the Egyptian material, but which is that wax, when you use it for this kind of thing, and if you at the end of the ritual or spell, if you burn the wax, then if it's beeswax, it completely disappears, so there's no remnant left, which might somehow reconstitute itself and cause trouble, which is one of the things that these ancient spells are kind of keen to preclude. But he says wax of a deserted bee's comb, so in fact the bee's nest itself has to be deserted. Maybe that adds a little bit extra magic to the object itself. Anyway, the comparison of those 2 objects, one from Egypt at the end of its historical development, and one from Malaya, or it could be but actually collected in Oxford, and there'll be samples from all over Britain of that kind of thing. It's a very familiar kind of magic that sometimes people call a voodoo doll, or sticking of pins in a doll as a curse. And there's a connection between the 2 objects over a long period of time, since the beginning of time in some ways. And that's what in a nutshell, I'm going to explore in the talk. Okay. I should say some of the other pictures that I'm showing now. When I was sort of digging out some of the pictures for this, because I'm quite well known for having quite a lot of pictures and liking to show pictures and digging them out. There was a very interesting example recovered from graves, in fact, from people's tombs in Athens, and these are kind of lead figurines this time in miniature coffins that people actually had buried with them, but obviously not the normal thing you'd expect to find in a coffin, because the hands are tied behind their backs. They all have exaggerated genitals as well, and there may be a connection between this sort of magic and the sexual realm. why were they put in the graves? There's probably something. There's obviously an important magical act there, but they're part of this same tradition of taking little images of people, of dolls, mannequins, and doing something to them, sticking things in them, and putting them in particular places in order to avert bad luck or evil, in order to give bad luck or evil to someone else. The other Egyptian image I wanted to show you, I'm going to show you quite a few in fact, but was from one of the crypts at, I think this is Dendra, Chamber B, East crypt on the east wall. It was very, you know, some of these images, this is a drawing in fact, not the actual thing, it's quite difficult to get a picture of it, but some of these images are, you can see you've got someone making an offering before a god and a goddess. So on the extreme left of the picture in the scene, you've got someone, and the offering they're making looks very odd. I mean, it's almost think they may be playing a sport of some sort, because they've kind of got a round ball and they're kind of hitting it with a stick. And next to it, you've got someone making another kind of offering. They've got a kind of image of a gazelle, which they're sticking with a knife, and they're cutting it with a knife. I should say that in both cases the images are made of wax, and the gazelle in later times is seen as a desert animal, as symbolic of chaos, the chaos forces that the monarchy or the state seeks to control in one way. And the ball is actually probably a ball of wax. They're both images, both things are probably made of wax, so after they've been cut and hit in one way or another, they can be melted away, they can be thrown onto the fire and destroyed. So, and the ball shape is probably almost certainly representative of the eye of something. So we're talking about averting another well-known element of folklore, the evil eye, or the biting eye is another name for it, the ability of the eye to cast bad luck, or to hypnotize and cause trouble in one way or another. And striking the eye in this ritual is a way of which is made of averting the power of the evil eye. And the object, after it's been suitably beaten, presumably would again be cast onto the flames and melt away. So these are all part of the same. These are all part of the same constellation of ideas from ancient magic, and they all come. Some of the examples, one of the examples, the Malayan example, comes from an amazing collection of this kind of material called the Pitt Museum in Oxford, which is one of the greatest collections of anthropology, ethnology in the world, and rather an interesting museum because it's been around for a long time and it's a big collection. And the Pitt Rivers, who gives his name to the museum, was a great collector of this kind of. He was an archaeologist and a folklorist and a great collector of this kind of material. So they've kind of kept it. It's a huge collection on many floors. They've kept it as it was originally classified, which maybe if they were making a museum like this these days, they kind of wouldn't do that. So they've kept it in terms of functions. Usually you group things in terms of different cultures these days, you know, so you'd have stuff from India or from Egypt or from Britain, but when they made this collection they grouped it in terms of functions, human functions, so cooking or hunting, fighting or decoration of some sort, burial, and very importantly for us, curses and magic and witchcraft. Quite an important element of the museum there. It brings together material from all over the world and enables you to see connections that you might not notice otherwise. Okay, so we come to the main subject, which is an entity, a supernatural entity called Apophis. And in the picture it's shown as quite a large snake, in fact. with someone with a stick fending it off. In fact, the texts say that Apep is a monstrously large snake, far bigger than you would like. I mean, cubits and cubits long. It's a monstrous being. But it's images of Apep in this form are very obscure, very rare, because in a sense, representing something, you're kind of giving it power. So if you are going to represent something bad or evil like Apep, then you would tend to do it on a smaller scale. Usually very, very small. So it's obviously shown. Dangerous entities are usually shown in miniature, and this actually provides us quite an interesting magical technique that has been widely used ever since, in that if you want to reduce the power of something over you, or then visualizing it, or in one way or another, either in your mind or when you draw it as smaller, and even visualizing the process by which it is miniaturized, that is actually a very useful magical technique that is used to kind of reduce the power, certainly to you, so it doesn't have so much power over you if it's shown smaller. And the opposite of that, of course, is making things bigger, and that's usually done in divine context. If in magic, or it's usually said that you assume your divine form, which usually requires imagining yourself as much bigger, and the gods and goddesses in temples are usually represented as being greater than human size for that very reason, because that's their divine form is bigger. So if something's bad, you make it smaller. If something's good, you make it bigger, and there's a kind of dynamic to that. The name Apep, I've kind of gave it. What does it mean? I've given it this name, the Great Nasty, which is kind of the great bad thing, the very, very big bad thing, which is essentially what the Egyptian hieroglyphs, which are shown in the picture as well, kind of represent something bad on a big scale. So the Big Nasty kind of says it all, really. The hieroglyph, again, in the Egyptian tradition, if you're going to show the hieroglyphs or write the hieroglyphs of something that's got a bad vibe to it, then you'll tend to do something to the hieroglyphs to kind of overcome that, which is called mutilation. So the hieroglyph of the Apep, which is shown there as a serpent, a multi-curled serpent, is a bit fuzzy because, as I say, I'm finding samples of this at the right size. On the curves of the snake, you can see the representation of little knives being thrust into the snake to kind of keep it under control, to pin it down, if you like. The knives, from the shape of them, that's the traditional way you would show a flint knife, and flint is a very magical substance within the ancient world, certainly in Egypt, and even when they had alternatives like iron or copper or gold or whatever, they still always had flint knives, very beautifully made, some of the best manufacturers, in fact, probably for ritual reasons, because it is this magical substance. Okay, the hieroglyph. I've got the hieroglyph of the Hyksos king Apophis. I thought I was just mentioning, maybe because of the way it's transcribed into the Greek, the name Apophis, you might think he's actually named after the serpent Apophis, but in fact there is a variation in spelling. Although there's a little bit of a connection in that he's obviously named after the hippo goddess, Ipet. So he's devoted to the hippo goddess, and what you know about the Hyksos, who were kind of conquerors of Egypt in the second intermediate period, which I'll talk about in a minute. They were reputed to be worshippers of the god Set. But he's not actually named after the god Set. He's named after what's usually thought as the female version of the hippo. The hippo is a kind of emblem of royal prestige in Egypt. So it's not. It is quite an Egyptian name, really. And other pharaohs, more ancient pharaohs, have had that name as well, or a variant of it. So he's not actually named after the serpent Apophis, but which is an easy confusion to make. But he's named after the Hippo goddess, which has a connection with the whole Setian mythology, which kind of overlaps with some of this Apophis material. Okay, so why then? Is it interesting? Why do I find it interesting, and why do I think this is a subject that is worthy of discussion? There are three things that I think areas that make it particularly interesting. One is that it relates to the issue of absolute evil. I'm kind of used to it being someone who's trained as a philosopher. There's a whole branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of evil and absolute evil and relative evil and all the rest, so it's not such a bad thing. It's usually said, I think it's probably Blavatsky who said, that there's no such thing as absolute evil in the ancient world, in the ancient religion. It's always relative. You say evil is always relative. It's always a question of good for some and bad for others, which is an interesting point of view. But an entity like Apep or Apophis kind of overthrows that idea, really, because it is a concept very like absolute chaos, absolute evil in the ancient world. And it does raise lots of interesting issues about what is good and what is bad. So that's a very important reason to investigate this material. The second reason is related to the history of magic itself, because of the struggle against this entity in the archaic world, in the very, very old world. Lots of magical techniques emerge at that time. I mean, it could even be argued that the origin of magic, or certainly it occurs in this struggle with these chaos demons from the ancient nameless past. So that's the third question: is when and where did these ideas actually emerge into human philosophy and human life? So there's quite a lot of material there. I'm just going to kind of trace out some of the issues, really, rather than going into them in too much detail, but enough, I hope, to kind of show that it's interesting material, this. For magic, this really lovely statue which is showing this image of the well, it's found in someone's tomb. It symbolises the car, in fact, and which is the kind of double, sometimes translated as the soul. Or the image is the image, is another meaning of the car. And magic, the word for magic in Egypt, hekar, includes the concept of the car. It's obviously very tied up with images, with the multiplication of images and the manipulation of images. That's very definitive of the magical tradition of Egypt. So that's why the car is there. It's all about images. And in fact, for those cultures such as the early Hebrews who wanted to differentiate themselves from the Egyptian culture, when in their myth they kind of leave it behind, when they separate themselves, in the list of new rules that they write for themselves, what we call the Ten Commandments, it's notable that I think it's the third commandment, says make no graven images, i.e. don't do this image stuff. We don't even have an image of the god. It's not supposed to. Famously, from a lot of the different elements, don't have images of the god. And this has always been a big issue for the Abrahamic religions, the issue of the creation of images. And when you're talking about images, you can't really think of a culture in the ancient world that is more connected, as more visual than the Egyptian culture. It's almost defined by its love of images and its skill at the construction of images, and that includes the magical construction of images. So the Ten Commandments obviously have the Egyptians in mind when they make that kind of ban on the making of images. It's a good way of a lot of the rules that you find in other religions are reactions to the Egyptian and the pagan, ways of separating yourself away from them by not doing what they do. In magic, obviously a huge subject. Egyptians are very, very good at this. The key things that when we talk about magic, some of the techniques, rather than trying to talk about what it is in essence, the techniques that are related to our pep as well are to enclose something, or to encircle it, if you like, to form a barrier around it, or to form a barrier around yourself and your family as to keep out the bad influences. That's to enclose something. The earliest form of enclosure usually is a kind of square of some sort in Egypt from the archaeology, but other people have seen a kind of band or a rope or whatever, as you see in the cartouche, where the name to be protected is encircled by a cord of rope. And in fact, again in the word hekar for magic, the he bit of the name is represented by a rope, a coil of rope, and the binding, if you like, the taking of coils of rope and binding of things. That's a very distinctive magical activity, really, to bind things or to encircle things with rope. And you see that in some of the pictures. There's the cartouche there, with the name of the pharaoh, I think it's Mark Ra, with a circle of rope around it. And on the other picture, which is from Edfu, you've got a representation of the temple, again with a kind of circle of a lasso, almost, of rope, with the god lassoing around the temple, kind of protecting it, encircling it, enclosing it. Another important technique of magic would be licking and swallowing. I'm going to go through these quite quickly. I'm not going to go into any detail. So there's a kind of quite earthy relationship between yourself and the actions you're taking. And related to eating and swallowing, we'd say spitting, right? Spitting, the use of saliva. The magical fluids of the body have special qualities, and the spitting upon something is a very, very old technique that people have spotted in all sorts of other areas. It can be used for healing, of course, but it can also quite commonly used for cursing. Okay, so that we're talking about the evil eye. Apophis is dangerous. Is this dangerous supernatural entity, and he's especially dangerous to the sun god Ra, who is, in the course of his journey, is through the day and through the night, which is recorded in books, famous books such as the Book of the Dead, has certain obstacles and hazards along the way, and there are particular moments of great danger, especially before he emerges from the underworld at dawn, when he is harassed and threatened by these supernatural entities, especially Apophis, who's this enormous creature. And in the representations from Egypt, the sun god is usually shown in a boat, which is the sort of the usual way in which the gods are thought to move around within the cosmos, on the celestial river or on the actual river. You know, they move on boats, and he's towed by various other lesser supernatural beings, and there are other beings like Horus and Set and others who stand in the boat to kind of guard against certain bad things happening. And the colossal serpent Apophis rises out of the waters in front of the boat. Now they're all gods. His power is the power of the evil eye. So he casts the evil eye on the people within the boat, and they can no longer carry on with the journey. They can't row, they can't steer, they can't do anything. They're kind of hypnotized. And in a lot of the imagery that we're going to look at later, the the only god, right, who is resistant to the evil eye of Apophis is the god Set, and he, for some reason, is not hypnotized or affected by the evil eye, and is able to take his iron spear and pin the Apophis down, and that's one of his most important roles within mythology, is the overcoming and deriding of Set, so that the sun god can continue his journey. In fact, he's the emanation of the sun god, made for that purpose, to be able to overcome these really violent things. And you might wonder why Set would be immune to the power of the evil eye, whereas the other gods seem to just be completely helpless when confronted with this idea. And yeah, that's an area we could discuss for quite a long time, but I suppose you're talking about maybe Set is immune to the evil eye because he shares something with Apophis. He has a common nature. So another important magical principle there is that you fight fire with fire. You use similar things to fight other things that are, that are equally as violent, maybe. That's a strong possibility. And when you look at some of these texts and spells and rituals in detail, it's quite easy to mix up wonder which god they are actually talking about, because so many of the things, like Set is sometimes called a storm deity, so his Apophis is connected with storms. It would be quite easy to mix them up, and in fact it's quite likely that in later times, towards the end of the Egyptian historical timeline, when it's sometimes said that Set the cult of Set went into some sort of decline, and he was not viewed with the same prestige that he'd had in earlier times, that a lot of the stuff that would originally have been directed against Apophis is directed against Set. So the Egyptians themselves blur the distinctions, especially again when the Greeks were in control, because they imported a lot of other ideas about their chaotic demon and chaos demons that they kind of grafted into the Egyptian system, or were accepted there. So that's why Set and Apophis are often linked together, that one is used against the other.